Okay, right. Well, we'll make a start here. First of all, welcome and thank you to everybody for coming to a talk at 10 a.m. on a Sunday after, I'm sure, a very lively evening. So thank you so much. In case you didn't actually come in on a Sunday and just kind of fell asleep in the room last night and aren't sure what's going on, this is going to be a talk about post-colonialism in late 1980s Doctor Who, and I do hope you'll stay. Looking specifically at the case of Remembrance of the Daleks. This is a paper which was previously presented at the University of Lincoln at the Stone Tape Symposium and was co-authored with Alan Stevens of Magic Bullet Productions, who's not here today, but since I'm the one who spends most of my time in front of a classroom, I'm probably the one to talk. I feel a bit weird when I see professor on a program. I always feel like, it looks like it should be, people will be expecting some kind of steampunk DJ, and I should be dropping fat rhymes in a pith helmet or something, but no, you get me. Anyway, how many people went to John's lecture on archaeology in Doctor Who yesterday? Oh, sorry. It was packed out, but yeah, excellent, because you may have noticed that he finished by briefly talking about Doctor Who as an imperialist text. And I went, yes! Not just because I had managed to get in, but because this is kind of our starting point. But it wasn't and isn't always uncritically imperialist, and in particular we're going to be looking at an era of the show when post-colonial writing was actually dominant within the series, the Cartmel era of the late 1980s, and we're going to argue that this dominance was enabled specifically by the thing that people tend most often to criticize about the era, namely its obsessive revisiting of its own past and continuity. Okay, so first of all, kind of a quick whistle-stop tour of what is colonialism and post-colonialism as they apply to us here. Okay, colonialism is a complex and varied social phenomenon which can be loosely defined as a period of empire characterized by territorial acquisition and subjugation of the people in the conquered territory. And there's quite a few good books written on it if you want to read more. It's also characterized by other complexes such as a focus on resource extraction and complex hierarchies between colonized, people of mixed origins who are the result of liaisons between the two, and more ambiguously placed groups, for instance, Indians and Jews in South Africa. So while this phenomenon is possibly quite as old as civilization and is certainly carrying on in the present day, usually post-colonial scholars tend to focus on the colonial period as being between 1492 and 1945. So that's kind of what colonial period we'll be referring to here today. Now, post-colonialism is similarly complex and varied. McEwen, in her book Postcolonialism and Development, notes that it refers literally to the state of being after colonialism, so, post-colonialism. But to think of it simply in those terms is kind of to make the false assumption that colonialism has ended, rather than, as post-colonial theorists argue, change in form and nature. Indeed, she notes there is no clear consensus as to its definition. So post-colonialism, more broadly, refers to the social, political, and economic aftermath of colonialism, including but not limited to the continuation of colonial relations by other means, discourses of development, and the acknowledgement of the colonial underpinnings of modern society and science. So even if the colonial period has ended, it still informs a lot of what people are doing. So in this article, we're going to be focusing on post-colonialism in its literary sense, as a movement which critiques representations of the colonized in literature, supports the rise of developing world literature, and challenges and or subverts colonial literature. So There are also connections with postmodernist literature, which trades in parody, pastiche, subversion, reimagining, and the questioning of established representations. Under colonialism, literature is frequently a tool for perpetrating colonial relations, as described by postmodernist writer Homi Bhabha. In his article Mimicry and Man, Homi Bhabha discusses how, as part of the so-called civilizing mission, the colonial authorities wanted their colonized subjects to imitate the manners, language, and society of the imperial center. However, they wished this imitation only to be partial, so colonized subjects remained separate and still requiring British rule. So if you look at, pick a colony, Australia, India, Canada, New Zealand, whatever, if you look at the 19th century literature, it reads like, kind of cargo cult Victoriana. They're really clearly looking to the center. It's only later on, as the colonial movement starts to become a bit more ambiguous, that you start seeing new voices and new developments. So consequently, the subversion or reimagining colonial literature becomes part of the colonial project. So Reed defines 3 post-colonial strategies for constructing productive spaces, gaps, and disjunctions to renovate the dominant English language and literature of the empire. Specifically, she identifies appropriation, capturing and remolding the language, making it bear the burden of the colonial experience. So something like there's a much cited production of Macbeth, which was done entirely in New Guinean Pidgin. Writing back to the imperial center, rewriting major canonical works of English literature to resist and challenge the assumption of the source text. For instance, Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea as a response to Bronte's Jane Eyre, or in the SF field, for instance, the novel A Scientific Romance as a kind of a reading back of H.G. Wells's The Time Machine in a post-colonial context. And finally, mimicry, how the colonized adopt the language and forms of empire, but in doing so alter and distort the dominant meanings so they reflect back to the colonizer a displaced image of his or her world which is unsettling to the colonial authority. So it's possibly arguable as a post-colonial text, but Spike Lee's film Bamboozled might provide an example of this, where he sort of explores Black American identity through the trope of the minstrel show and, sort of a black, in all senses of the word, satire on the minstrel show. Now, Doctor Who's post-colonial leanings generally tend to take the second and third forms, as it's speaking from the center rather than the periphery, but it is criticizing and rewriting the works of the center to challenge their assumptions, as well as sometimes distorting and exaggerating the images of colonial literature in order to satirize them, and we'll talk about examples later.